Peace and Anarchy, Episode 2.
Could it all be a bad dream or a nightmare? Is it my imagination, or have we lost our minds?
If you got a business, that you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen.
I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system.
Violence and lost liberty will result without some revolutionary thinking. We must escape from the madness of crowds now gathering.
All right, welcome to Peace and Anarchy, Episode 2. So, as many of you know, earlier this week we had the annual State of the Union address, and it's been somewhat of a tradition with me that I live tweet throughout the entire thing. I used to do this for all of the debates as well as the State of the Union, but as time has gone on, the debates have become more and more ridiculous.
Yeah, they're hard to watch.
And just incredibly hard to watch, and I end up repeating myself and the snarkiness that I put in the debate so much that I just get tired of it. I'm not adding anything new to the conversation. So I really have been limiting myself this year to just the major events, so I might cover the main debates when it comes down to whoever the Republican nominee and the Democratic nominee are, and the State of the Union. And every year I swear I'm not going to watch the State of the Union, and then I always do.
And I, on the other hand, never watch them. In fact, starting the podcast with you, Tabor, is what caused me to watch this time around. I have to say it's excruciating. In preparing some other recorded audio that we have for the show, and part of our opening and closing music has some of Obama talking. And we have one segment where it's Ron Paul in his farewell address to Congress, and you also hear bits of Obama in this most recent State of the Union. And I can't describe in adequate words how obnoxious it is to work through a speech from a man who puts a pause between every word. I mean, it's an hour-long speech, but there's maybe 38 minutes of real speaking there.
It's like commercial time during television shows.
Really frustrating.
So I think the reason why I power through it every year goes back to, I believe it's in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Harry Potter
inspires your watching of the State of the Union.
So after the incidents of Goblet of Fire, the Ministry of Magic in Book 5 puts a ministry woman in charge of the Defense of the Dark Arts class, Dolores Umbridge. And during
an evil person?
Obviously.
Okay.
No, never trust someone wearing a pink sweater and a suit jacket, right? What is it, pantsuits? Never trust the pantsuits. So the Ministry of Magic places this woman as somewhat of a spy within the school, and she gives an opening lecture about the craziness that she is about to embark. Of course, she doesn't describe it as crazy, but anyone listening to it is. And it's mentioned in there that none of the students paid attention to the speech except for Hermione. And when Ron and Harry asked her why she was paying attention, she noted it's very important to know what the opposition is saying.
Ah, fair point.
And I think that's really what started me down the path of, you have to sit through it because they will say something. And it does go along the lines of, if you give someone enough rope, they'll hang themselves, and I think Obama did that at several points during this speech.
Yeah, by the way, what the other guys are saying is lunacy, to wrap it up. So that's the end of the show today. Thanks for listening. Obama's crazy. No,
don't worry, the Republican responses were, I'm sure, just as crazy.
Oh, yeah. So what we're going to do today is really get into the State of the Union. We're not going to go line by line because we're not sadomasochists, but we are going to go sort of paragraph by paragraph for you, the listener, and apply a real libertarian analysis. You're not going to get the standard pundit, Fox News or MSNBC rundown. This is going to be very hardcore Rothbardian stuff.
Well, especially since the pundits all were concerned about what Mrs. Obama wore to the thing as opposed to the content of his speech.
Which is just of immediate national importance, right? Okay, so you want to start us off, on this first page here. What do you see? What pops out to you as strikingly horrible?
All of it. So he opens off with just a list of all of the legislation that he hoped hopes he will accomplish, and it's just this list of broken immigration system, protect our kids from gun violence, because it's always about the children.
Of course.
Equal pay for equal work, paid leave, and raising the minimum wage.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing what we're going to see throughout here is just his poor method of discussing these things. Of course, he starts by saying, I want to go easy on the traditional list of proposals, just before he lists all of these horrible proposals. And we'll notice in the transcript that equal pay for equal work is capitalized. This is a seminal program where we want to legislate the wages of all people, and a sort of corollary thought from the notion that by writing on a piece of paper, we can magically bring into existence a sort of wage structure in society that we want to see. I mean,
right, and the idea that the wage gap even exists has been long since proven to be a myth.
Right, and of course, the wage gap is this, like you say,
it's the notion that women earn 77 cents for every dollar that a man earns.
Right.
Now, in order to get to this statistic, it's jumps after jumps of bad statistical conclusions. So that figure comes from averaging all jobs that women do with all jobs that men do. It also lumps all marital statuses together. It lumps all do you have children statuses together. And we find that those really do affect the potential earnings of whatever worker. It doesn't matter what gender you are. And that really comes down to productivity. Wages are directly correlated to productivity, so the more productive you are, the more wages you earn. And that's one of the reasons why we love having capital in our environment, because it allows us to be more productive.
And it's not just a correlation, it's causation, right? High productivity brings about higher wages.
Correct. And so this notion that we need to mandate this work to be equal, if it stems from this faulty statistic, that's just a bad idea to begin with. And then on top of that, the methodology is bad. Women tend to have different likes and concerns than men.
Uh-huh.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Having children, for instance.
We are, right. Not me in particular, but others, I assume. So we are all individuals. This has nothing to do with grouping us into these large conglomerates. Mm-hmm. And I know personally, I've been told that I'm a feminist, and I strongly disagree with that sentiment. That when you create these groups, you're really telling people that everyone in that group it's just a homogenous blob.
So like the group called women.
The group called women. And, when you look at that group called women, there's a large amount of, to use a term from the left, diversity within there. I'm a female engineer, and in Silicon Valley, which according to feminists is one of those so-called unicorns in the bro code industry, or whatever they're calling it these days. And, I've never been told by a man that I can't do something. The only times I've ever been told that you can't do something or you shouldn't do something has been from feminists.
Wow.
Who are upset with whatever it is that I'm doing, probably fighting state controls over this other thing.
Or maybe protesting an effort to provide for equal pay for women, regardless of...
and the whole notion that I need the government to step in and protect poor little old me because I'm female and boo-hoo, I can't make it in this world is just so patronizing.
Yeah. In fact, we get another flare of that patronization when he writes says that we need to protect our kids from gun violence. I mean, the contortion that this poor possessive pronoun has had to go through, namely our, right?
It takes a village.
According to Obama, it takes the whole damn nation. He wants our kids to be protected from gun violence. Of course, what that means is all sorts of executive orders and actions around guns, preventing law-abiding citizens from applying in the first place, or worse, putting them on a list of the quote-unquote mentally unstable or people who are convicted felons. I mean, I, as a libertarian, have problems with both of these. I mean, By the way, Tabor, you and I, being on this podcast, saying what we're saying, are probably officially mentally insane. If we pop up,
I've been on that list for a long time. This is not news. I'm already on the TSA list. I might as well join the other ones.
If the state comes out with some new directory of people holding un-American views, we're probably towards the top of the list, at least for our age group.
Well, and just the fact that we've been to Ron Paul events and Judge Napolitano events where they tell us to take out our cell phones and let the NSA listen to what's going on, then, I'm already on the list, and I'm sure you have already been on that list, too.
Yeah. So he continues. A couple lines down, we have here that we live in a time of extraordinary change, and that this change can bring about economic disruptions and can strain working families.
Well, and of course, he highlights the word change because that was his entire campaign platform in 2008.
This is resurrecting a dead brand, is what Obama's doing here. He ends this bit on change by saying that this change can broaden opportunity or widen inequality. That horrid, horrid thing, inequality. Of course, if you read any of Thomas Sowell, we know that inequality is part and parcel of the human condition. It's existed forever. It exists now. I was going to say,
I hate to break it to you, Ryan, but you and I, we will never be equal.
This is true. In a number of ways. So that Obama believes that he can bring about by legislative action, or worse, executive fiat.
And another great work in the terms of inequality is the great Rothbard piece, where egalitarianism as a revolt against nature,
yes.
I really think that cuts to the heart of the mindset of these egalitarians, where they're really, oh God, to bring in a quote from Ayn Rand, anti-life, anti-mind, anti-reality.
And they very much are. Walter Block likes to say, any egalitarian or anti-inequality person who has two eyes is engaged in a contradiction. You can survive without one. Give the other eye to somebody who's blind. And he's totally right. Of course, nobody wants to take the status argument to their logical extremes. That would be breaking the rules.
Not only breaking the rules, it would show their own internal battle over trying to defend it.
Mm-hmm. Moving on here, we have that each time, quote, this is a quotation now, each time there have been those of us who have been told to fear the future, who claim that we could slam the brakes on change. So what he's saying here is that there are people, of course, probably of a conservative strain or a Republican strain, who want us to fear the future. But we're told, fear not, Obama is here.
I feel so safe already.
He's going to take care of us. Although he even quotes Lincoln. He says that one thing we shouldn't do is, quote, adhere to the dogmas of the quiet past. Which is very interesting because he's going to go on to tell us this horror story of a bombing campaign that he's releasing in the Middle East. So I guess the question is, if we're not to fear, why then are, quote, 10,000 drone bombs required in a country that, or in an area that has nothing to do with the day-to-day life of Americans?
Well, because I think he says it's somewhere in there. It's because it's something, quote, we're good at. I'm glad you mentioned that. So the word we. So I wrote an article about this a little while back called "We is an Evil Word." We'll have to link to it in the show notes page. Fun fact, Obama uses the term we 118 times in a speech that spans, in text, 8 pages. And like I said earlier, about 38 minutes or 40 minutes of actual speaking time. This is a gross perversion of the collective pronoun we as well as our. We is what I say here is an improper term at best, and at worst it is evil. Anyone who sympathizes with victims of crimes should reject the inarticulate conceptualization of singular entities that bear no form in reality. Because we have to remember, we and our and society and the nation in true reality don't exist. They're all artificial constructs.
Yes.
That it's true, do make things a lot easier to explain in certain contexts, but we always have to remember the methodological individualism that comes with our Austrian training.
Yeah.
Individuals are the only ones who can act. Groups cannot act. And this is really an important point to make because it's the main failing point, I would say, or maybe the starting failing point for all of these collective groups that who want to use the government as their enforcement mechanism for what they want.
Right. In fact, we have a great quotation from Man, Economy, and State. That's the big book, what we call with fancy Latin language the magnum opus of Murray Rothbard. He writes, "The term society, then, denotes a pattern of interpersonal exchanges among human beings. It is obviously absurd to treat, quote, society as, quote, real, with some independent force of its own. There is no reality to society apart from the individuals who compose it, and whose actions determine the type of social pattern that will be established."
And it's also an interesting thing to point out that a lot of times when people bring up the group, it's the Star Trekian notion that the needs of the many are more important than the needs of the one. And, you know, that one person is in fact part of that group, is it not? Am I not part of this collective group known as the American citizenry?
Right.
I think I am. And so what I want is just as important as what anyone else wants. And that's what libertarianism really brings forward, is that we are free to seek our own futures and seek our own wants, and we're not bound by this notion that I have to serve everybody else. And
yeah,
it just speaks to the anti-individualism of government, period.
Right. For example, we can look at just about 7 minutes and 45 seconds into the speech. Obama says that we secured the freedom in every state to marry the person we love. Now, of course, this is a big topic. Non-traditional marriage, there's so many different gender types and sex types, I won't even attempt to...
Well, that's because they're too numerous to list.
Catalog them, yeah. So the notion of non-traditional marriage is obviously big in popular culture now. Of course, that's one of our main categories that we want to talk about. Tabor, you tell me, isn't the libertarian position to agree with Obama? Isn't this a great thing that in every state, quote unquote, we secured the right to marry the person that we love?
Well, the real answer is to get the state out of marriage altogether. And in fact, it really wasn't until fairly recently in human history that the state entity was ever involved with marriage in the first place. So marriage certificates became popular in order to prevent interracial marriage. That was the whole purpose of the blood test. It wasn't to show, oh, turns out you two are cousins and you can't get married. Had nothing to do with that. That was just the public excuse that they gave. It was really to check, are you somewhat ethnic in your background?
Sure, to institutionalize racism.
Right. And so, for those who are fighting for that right to marriage, who says you need the government to certify that you love whoever it is that you want to get married to?
Right.
And on top of that, what gives the government the authority to define the word marriage in the first place?
Well,
it's absurd either way. It's absurd to have the government to be in control of marriage, and it's absurd to have the government define marriage as strictly between a man and a woman. Language is not something that can be owned. Language is something that develops over the years. And so both extremes are incredibly wrong.
Yeah. The way I look at it personally, people ask me, oh, you plan on getting married? And the way I see it, I don't need a government clerk or a church cleric's permission to spend my life with whomever I see fit. And I mean that literally, living in the same home for a number of years on end, this sort of thing. I don't need anybody's particular permission. Now, there are some sort of tax consequences. Perhaps it's in someone's financial interest to sign this state document and submit it to the appropriate bureaucrat for processing. But that's separate and apart from this notion that marriage, as we consider it meaningfully in today's language, must be certified by the government. Totally different thing. If you're doing it to escape some taxation, more power to you.
Right, and in that instance, it should be any two people should be able to make this certification.
Right.
And it doesn't... The idea that it has to be this romantic love is also absurd, too. Two people can band together in companionship and should be able to get whatever tax break or the visitation rights at hospitals, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's a big thing when I talk to people about it. And I tell them my views on it, especially in this area, in the San Francisco Bay Area where we are. The opportunity to discuss this comes up a lot.
Well, not to use the horrid term "we" again, but...
Yeah, this is true. Good
the San
point.
Francisco Bay Area was at the forefront of that entire battle, and Gavin Newsom, he did an act of nullification, I will say, in performing gay marriages at City Hall outside of what the state of California wanted to do.
Gavin Newsom being a former mayor.
He was former mayor of San Francisco. And in that particular use of his governmental power, I did support that because it was entirely a nullification attitude.
Yeah.
It was, I don't care what the state of California says. I know this is right, and I'm going to offer it.
Yeah. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, right?
Yeah. But back to the speech here.
Sure. So after he presents his 4 questions, we'll get into the substance of his little questions, but just shortly after his 4th, he says, about 10 minutes and 45 seconds in, let me start with the economy and a basic fact. The United States of America right now has the strongest, most durable economy in the world. Would you agree with that diagnosis?
It's almost laughable.
Yeah, it's difficult. For me, just before we even get into the meat of it, to say the most durable. I mean, what's durable? Is the economy a capital good now? We're concerned about its effective lifespan? I mean, when did we reduce ourselves to describing the economy in terms of durability? Very odd.
Well, you need so many life cycles to maintain the engine of the economy.
Very mechanistic, materialistic way to view exchange and trade. But anyway,
well, that goes back to the whole notion of economics as an engineering science for politicians, right? They treat the real world as if it was a controlled experiment.
Yes. And the particulars of the difference in Austrian economics, I suppose, with the mainstream view, we might have to save that for its own show down the road.
That will be a great many shows, I'm sure.
But he says that we have 14 million new jobs. What do you hate jobs, Tabor?
Maybe I do. I don't know.
Well,
but when he compares those statistics, he's comparing to the end of the Bush regime,
right.
Which Bush was no great president either. But he's comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah,
you can't claim that you've added so many jobs to the economy when you started at a way below average starting point.
Right.
You're comparing to an abnormal start when you should be comparing to the average. And the whole notion that it's even a statistic to be compared is also absurd.
Of course, and we don't know how many of those new jobs are government jobs. Right.
Remember the influx of temporary census worker jobs?
Oh, yeah. The jobs report looked great that quarter. All right, continuing on, we have some interesting notions of capital and how capital is used in society. At about 12 and a half minutes in, Obama says that, quote, technology doesn't just replace jobs on the assembly line, but any job where work can be automated. He says that workers, as a consequence, have less leverage for a raise, and that more and more wealth and income is concentrated at the very top. So he's named all of these phenomena, namely wealth disparity, concentration of wealth at the top, and the automation of of certain tasks in the economy. And he's attributing all of these things to the fact that, well, technology's changing. Technology's different. Everyone's screwed.
Well, he also has this backwards, because what technology does is it increases productivity. And I think we've already mentioned that wages are a result of the productivity of the workers.
Right.
So if the worker is able to accomplish more with the capital equipment, then by all means they would be earning a higher wage. What he's really concerned about is that there would be less physical people in those jobs. But this is a process that I believe it was Schumpeter called creative destruction.
Uh-huh.
And so what is actually happening here is that we're getting a freeing up of resources. So those people that are no longer employed in that industry, it turns out what the market is saying is that these people have a better purpose out there somewhere else.
Right.
And while it may take some time for them to find that purpose, there is a spot for them. There always will be. The market it's there in place for humans, so it cannot be anti-human by definition.
Yeah, and these items are important to identify because it's the ideological and intellectual foundation for his proposals that we'll get to here soon. But of course, the answer for any state official, especially somebody of such high authority, is one, to perceive a problem and then in the very next breath suggest some sort of government solution. Never is it that the state was the problem in the first place.
Well, that goes to, there's a great poster out there it's a picture of the Capitol building at the sunset. At the bottom it says, government. If you don't like the problems we create, just wait until you see our solutions for them.
Exactly. And that's exactly the case.
Well, not to mention that solution that they usually come up with is none other than education.
Uh-huh. Yeah, he does begin to speak about education around the 14-minute mark.
Well, the answer to everything for a politician in his mindset is education. It's always, we need to educate people to get better jobs. And while education does lead to some jobs, it is not the end-all answer, because education can only provide so much, and it doesn't provide everything.
Right.
What happens is that the government has subsidized a college education to a degree where the technical schools have been greatly neglected. And try to find a skilled plumber on the cheap. It is not easy.
Yeah. Best of luck. We see when he does speak about education, he says, quote, "We've increased early childhood education, lifted high school graduation rates to new highs, and boosted graduates in field like engineering." Boy, he's claiming a lot of credit for things that happened in this country.
Well, did they really raise the average student up, or did they lower the standards
down?
Down. Because I remember taking the California high school exit exam, and this was not the year that they reinstituted it, but the year afterwards, and there was still a huge clamor of, it's too hard for people to pass. It's discriminating against minorities. And I have to say, if you couldn't pass this test, which was a high school exit examination written at the 6th grade level, you didn't deserve to pass high school.
Imagine that, though, huh?
The questions in the math section were things along the lines of, here's a graph with the axes labeled, here's a line, what's the y-intercept?
Oh, dear.
If you can't count the ticks on the y-axis, you shouldn't be graduating.
Yeah. And, of course...
So what they do is they just lower the standards, and that goes back to, he mentions No Child Left Behind in here, which, of course, was instituted by another one of our favorite presidents, George Bush. I say that sarcastically if you didn't catch that. Because I ended up in the year that had to take the No Child Left Behind standardized science test.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. So every year from the months of January through April, when these tests happen, all schools do is teach how to take the test. And in fact, that's a particular interest of mine that I'm sure we can make a whole episode out of. But this science No Child Left Behind test, it followed every year. So each year got a different topic. My year happened to be science. And every year we'd take this test. Well, it turns out they never actually updated the test. It was the exact same questions as the year before.
No kidding.
And I remember this because the questions were beyond absurd. They were questions like, wind flows from blank pressure to blank pressure. A, high to low. B, low to high. C, red to green. D, none of the above.
Oh my.
If anyone marked C, I'm not sure what's going on there. So they lower these standards to a point where everyone passes, which artificially looks like, oh, we've raised the educational standards when you didn't.
Yeah, so that the president in the State of the Union can say exactly that he did. So here we have it. We have an incorrect diagnosis of what's been going on, right? Namely that technology has caused these alleged problems that are quote-unquote squeezing workers. And then we have the return to the end-all, be-all for a politician in campaign mode, which is turning to education and the centrality and the necessity of education in order to earn a wage. And then here's the kicker, the new government program, right? That's to solve the problem. Obama says we should build on that progress by providing pre-K for all, offering every student hands-on computer science and math classes, and that we should recruit and support more great teachers for our kids. Well,
because, of course, the government's been so great in picking which technologies will flourish and which ones won't. I remember the government picking fluorescent bulbs over LEDs, and that's only hindered our progress in terms of lighting.
Those are the hospital lights, right? They look like the white ones?
Fluorescent tubes, those are the schools, the ones that flicker.
Yeah, great.
And compact fluorescents, they're the ones that have mercury in the bulb, so if they break, it has a whole special disposal system. LEDs have none of that problem. But of course, if the educational thing doesn't work out and you have to go find another job, what happens if that job pays less than your previous job?
What would Obama say for that?
We know exactly what he would say.
He
wants to institute a system of, quote, wage insurance.
Jeez. And okay, so he says, if that new job doesn't pay as much, so this is Obama, if that new job for you formerly unemployed person doesn't pay as much, there should be a system of wage insurance in place so that he can still pay his bills. You'll notice if you watch back the YouTube or whatever type you choose to watch the show again, if you really wanted to cause yourself some pain, you notice that nobody applauds for this one. And as far as I know, maybe I haven't watched the news enough, this idea of wage insurance,
I have never heard that before,
is out of nowhere for him.
And honestly, I think that's because the audience was in a state of shock.
It's very strange. So let's get this clear, folks. Look, you have a job, say you're making $50 an hour. Okay? You lose your job, or something happens. For whatever reason, you no longer work there. You get a job for, say, half, $25 an hour, right? Under a system of wage insurance, at least conceptually speaking, the government then is going to provide you that remaining $25 per hour that you used to earn.
And where, pray tell, is the government going to get that money from?
Except the pocket of some other person. Really remarkable stuff there.
And the idea that the wages are tied to the person as opposed to the productivity of that person in that particular job is also quite crazy. I, as an engineer, I could do a few other jobs, I'm sure, fairly competently. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure I could handle being a burger flipper at McDonald's. Is my productivity in that job up to what my productivity level is as a mechanical engineer?
No.
Not at all. And, of course, this also goes to the whole notion of abolishing comparative advantage. And that every person has a comparative advantage somewhere. And so what he's trying to do is say that everyone is equal in terms of their wage earnings, no matter what.
Literally, no matter what.
No matter what.
No.
And as I'm sure we might get into in a later episode, the advantages from comparative advantage, the division of labor, we only get those advantages so long as people are unequal and have different qualities and different skills compared to other people.
Sure.
So, like, for instance, between us, you're much more skilled in the social media aspect of things than I am. And I'm much more skilled at the back-end website design.
Thank God. Goodness.
So, if we were both exactly equal, we would have no good trade to make there in terms of what we're bringing to this podcast.
Yeah, the theme of inequality and egalitarianism, of everyone being the same, I mean, it is woven throughout. It's not explicit, but it is there. Shortly after talking about wage insurance, he said, that's the way we make the new economy work better for everyone. If you notice on the eve of all political elections, there's always something new, right? Especially
what have you done for me lately?
Exactly. So the economy is now new, just like the sharing economy. There's another thing that's as a little aside that bothers me, this sharing economy. I think I put a Facebook post up about it. The government has destroyed economic activity to such a horrible extent that when some new technology or some new entrepreneurial enterprise comes about that is able to efficiently take supply and meet it to demand and facilitate voluntary exchange between people, when something new like that comes up, people have to give it a new name. We have to call it something different. The sharing economy. No, damn it, it's the economy. It's the same economy we've always had, and it's going to be there for as long as human beings are on the face of this planet. But so long as the government has to get into regular economic exchange, these new things like Airbnb and Uber come to us as if a godsend or something new and phenomenal. They're not. This is a functioning economy that's experiencing very low government intervention, at least for now, and hopefully it stays that way.
Oh, well, it goes back to the notion that it's as if it didn't exist before, and it did. It was just on a much smaller scale.
Right, or in some different form, right?
But it really comes down to what you said. It's the economy. It's like splitting rights between economic rights and civil rights. They're all one thing. They're all rights. Mm-hmm. And all interpersonal exchange we can call the economy, whether it's for money or for some other good.
Exactly. Continuing on, about 20 minutes in. Here we are. This is Obama. But there are other ways where it's been more difficult to find agreement over the last 7 years, namely what role the government should play in making sure the system's not rigged in favor of the wealthiest and biggest corporations. And here, the American people have a choice to make. My goodness, Tabor, we're charged with a pretty heavy thing. I mean, don't you hate evil big corporations?
I hate the government. I don't hate Walmart.
Yeah.
So,
by the way, the big corporations are decried here by virtue of being big. It's hating big corporations because they're big, because they're wealthy. It's a form of envy, isn't it?
Well, not only that, the whole idea that you get this disparity between the big corporations and the little corporations, or the mom and pop stores. So much of that is due to the government itself. And I'm not saying that the government creates corporations. What I'm saying is that corporations go to the government when they're big enough and wealthy enough, and they, give a little nudge to their congressman, and they say, hey, I'll donate to your funds, your re-election campaign. Maybe you can sneak in there a few little of these regulations that my competitors must have such and such style of equipment. They have to follow such safety requirements, whether or not it's feasible or not.
Exactly.
And so it's really these large crony capitalists,
special
cronyists, going in and controlling the government. So how could the government even possibly control these things when the two are part and parcel? They are the same thing. Right.
He spoke some about the new government accomplishments, like quote unquote reinventing our energy sector. We know that in higher education, there's a push to make community college free for all. Of course, we never ask who's benefiting. The textbook publishers are loving the artificial expansion of demand for higher education services, right?
This is not to mention the universities themselves.
Right, a whole new client base. The energy companies, the the crony solar companies are loving the state-backed reinvention, quote-unquote reinvention of the energy sector. They're the ones that are going to benefit.
Right, and with healthcare, we know it was the insurance companies that just loved Obamacare. Why? Because they're the ones who benefit.
Yeah.
And I find it particularly ironic that his next line after that is I believe a thriving private sector is the lifeblood of our economy.
That one was bad. I saw this part on on YouTube afterwards, and I think it was maybe the first time that some Republicans had an opportunity to stand and applaud. Although
not that they agree with the private sector either.
Although nobody in that room has a full appreciation of the role of the private sector in any economy, but yes, that's a truly funny line there.
Well, I have to say, even though I sit and watch these State of the Unions every single time, I really applauded Ron Paul for not sticking around and showing.
Oh, he'd bail out.
He very rarely, I think, ever went to one. I think he stopped going.
Oh, good. And
back in the 90s.
I think I saw during your live tweeting, you said that Thomas Jefferson's State of the Union.
Yeah, so Thomas Jefferson's State of the Union was a written address.
Ah.
Jefferson was not a particularly skilled orator, but beside that, he wasn't fond of the fanfare, from what I gather.
Yeah.
And it stayed a written address for many years, so I'm sure you've heard of the Monroe Doctrine.
Uh-huh.
That was Monroe's State of the Union address. It was a written address delivered to Congress. There was no fanfare. It was, here you go, see you later, bye.
Yeah, email me. God, he goes on and on about the great technological changes that somehow he's involved in. Well, geez, use it then. Send me this in an email.
Well, he spends about 5 minutes talking about innovation in space and the competition with the Russians.
Oh, and this American bravado that we have to put up with. He says, 60 years ago, when the Russians beat us into space, we didn't deny Sputnik was up there. We didn't argue about the science or shrink our research and development budget. We built a space program almost overnight, and 12 years later, we were walking on the moon. Boy, how good was that, huh? It's so pumped up with so much bravado and pride. I mean, to me, that demonstrates a very weak person. Someone who's very flimsy.
The whole nationalist idea is that we have to take credit for the accomplishments of the entire group when it's really a solo accomplishment.
Yeah.
Like, people say, oh, we won the most gold medals at the Olympics. Well, no, I didn't.
Right.
I got 0, and I'm sure I would be negative in the score list. No, whoever it was that actually won the race won the gold medal for themselves. It's a very nationalist and almost fascist idea that we have these heroes that work for the country.
And without them, what would we be? I think Lew Rockwell said some time ago, I forget in what format or forum, but his essential thought was regular Americans don't care a damn bit about some satellite in the sky on the other side of the world. These things like Sputnik and the Olympics, another big deal. You know, these big national events, in reality, have nothing to do with any of our day-to-day dealings.
No, and I have to say in regards to the space sector, so I'm a huge geek. I'm a huge nerd. I went to space camp as a kid back when NASA Ames had a space camp here locally.
Oh, okay.
And when I was in elementary school, my dream was to go work for NASA.
Ah, how times have changed.
The day I found out that NASA was a government organization was a very sad day because I knew I couldn't do it. So the idea that we had to have the government fund this research into space is also absurd. There were better uses for that technology at the time, and all we did was divert these resources elsewhere.
So shortly after, speaking of technology, shortly after discussing Sputnik...
well, if you notice, he used the word deny, and I think that's in complete reference to the deniers of climate change.
Ah, I see. I didn't catch that myself, but that could be. Before he gets into climate change, he has one little line, I believe it's the only one, where he talks about the internet, but he says, we've protected an open internet.
Really?
Truly, truly remarkable. The Trans-Pacific Partnership has all sorts, which he speaks of here closely thereafter, has all sorts of restrictions. CISA and what are the
CISA and PIPA and
right, and the proliferating nature of the NSA. I mean, protect the internet? Are you kidding me? Like, this is not. There's a very strong likelihood that before our listeners hear this conversation, some bureaucrat or some robot in some government building already has a full recording of it.
Especially because
internet.
it's us, right?
Right. Oh, my goodness. He says that we have launched the next generation manufacturing hubs and online tools that give an entrepreneur everything he or she needs to start a business in a single day. Again,
except you didn't start that.
Yes, you didn't build that, you silly person. But again, claiming credit regardless of whether or not you had anything to do with it. He continues on. He says that medical research is critical. Well, who's going to disagree with that little bit of insight, huh?
Well, medical research is critical. Government funding of it is not.
Well, if that's the case, we're really in for it. He says that Vice President Biden has worked with this Congress to give scientists at the National Institute of Health the strongest resources they've had in over a decade. Now, I wasn't aware of this. Some new funding for the National Institutes of Health, as if centralizing the funding process for medical research was a good idea.
Well, and again, anytime the government invests resources in something, it artificially favors that research over other research, and you don't know what you're going to miss because of that. We already noted that we missed out on how many decades of LEDs because of the government's artificial preference for fluorescence.
Yeah. This is a crucial thing to understand about the nature of government outside of just its more blatant, obvious takeovers of things, right? Clearly, things like eminent domain. Well, that's an obvious instance where the government is coming in and confiscating some real-life property that we can see and we can point to and say, look what the government's doing, how terrible it is. But like what the French classical liberal Frédéric Bastiat talked about with the broken window fallacy, the real damage the state does is what is unseen.
Absolutely.
So the money that is going, this new influx of funding, the strongest resources that the National Institutes of Health has seen in over a decade, that money could have been somewhere else. And would have,
well, it would be somewhere else. That's
right.
The key. It's not just a could, it's a would. If the window hadn't been broken, the shop owner would have spent that money on something else.
Right.
Whether it's investment or something physical.
Instead of repairing
the window.
What was already there. Oh yeah, here it comes. He says, look, if anybody still wants to dispute the science around climate change, have at it.
Can I please? Pick me.
Go for it, please.
So, I have an interesting experience with the whole climate change movement in general. Mm-hmm. So when I was at Hopkins, I double majored in mechanical engineering and biology. And these two departments have very strong opinions on opposite ends of the spectrum. The mechanical engineering professors, who are well versed in fluid dynamics, well know that we can't model turbulence pretty much at all.
All right.
And my favorite professor was quite fond of saying, we can't accurately model water flowing out of a faucet. How could we possibly model the climate in the future? And then contrast that with what the biology department was saying, which was, well, the evidence is obvious. The Earth is warming up. And that was pretty much the extent of their evidence. Was
as a given.
It's, don't you know? It's hot on Halloween. Clearly there's climate change.
Well, according to Obama, I mean, if you disagree, you're debating our military, most of America's business leaders, and the majority of the American people, and almost the entire scientific community.
Well, I don't think it's ever been settled in the scientific community, as I just illustrated.
Mm-hmm. I'd have to agree. Now, I've got very little knowledge about the climate or the weather or molecules or biology even, but I've got some sense of individual rights. So let's suppose that the planet was going to burn down tomorrow because of the evil, dirty capitalists. But even from that, it does not follow that Obama or anybody in some arbitrary institution should then get to violate the private property rights that I or anybody else has over their own property. It would require something else.
Well, this really speaks to the importance of the price system in general. If resources become scarce, the price increases. And when the price increases, that sends a message to entrepreneurs saying, this is something that's valued by the market. Go research it. Go find out a way to fix it. Because people will pay you for it. And so when we have the government take over these things, we're obscuring these price signals. And that's really what changes things for the better. If the air quality suddenly made air a scarce resource, you bet there would be instantaneously a market for air, and there'd be people that would run out there and try to figure out a way to bottle it up and sell it to us so that there's no longer that same scarcity.
Right. And this is how the profit system works.
Right. Profits are one of the most moral things one can seek in life. I know in school we're always told the noblest thing one can do is seek political office. No, the noblest thing one can do...
the opposite.
The noblest thing one can do is actually to seek a profit, because you can only earn a true profit by serving your fellow human beings.
Yeah,
which is interesting when Obama goes in and says, gas under $2 a gallon ain't bad either.
Yeah. Well, on the whole climate change, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of my favorite people in the world. Not necessarily a anarcho-capitalist or a libertarian or even an Austrian, but a comedian, George Carlin. I'm going to have to read here, but the wonder and beauty in his words, I think, are deserving. He says, "We're so self-important. Everybody's got to have something new. Save the trees, save the bees, save the whales, save those snails. And the greatest arrogance of all, save the planet. Save the planet. We don't even know how to take care of ourselves yet. I'm tired of this shit. I'm tired of Earth Day. I'm tired of these self-righteous environmentalists, these white bourgeois liberals who think the only thing wrong with this country is that there aren't enough bicycle paths." It's so good. It's so good.
Well, I especially think later on in that same routine, he talks about how maybe the Earth actually wanted that plastic, and that was the whole purpose for the human race.
Right.
Yeah. Carlin's great. Right, actually, his very first film role was on a Doris Day movie.
Yeah, I remember that. Reading his biography, I guess, or his biography co-written with somebody else. He includes that story. But
yeah,
anyway.
And it was her last film.
All right, moving forward.
Continuing on. So back to the Obama made a little aside in there saying gas under $2 a gallon ain't bad either, which is particularly ironic given his earlier propensity to call for higher prices so that he could stimulate the economy in alternative energy sources.
Sure, and of course, having high energy prices is a great thing for the environmentalist crowd. They love that these quote-unquote dirty methods of feeding and clothing ourselves and pursuing our own goals in life, they want these prices to be higher so that the trees and the turtles and the birds and the insects can all flourish.
Well, and you notice they never talk about the humans.
Right. No place for humanity in that in that scheme of things.
But speaking of hot air, I think we're coming close to our favorite part of this State of the Union, which is...
Oh, God.
The United States of America is the most powerful nation on Earth. Period.
Oh, jeez.
It's not even close. And he goes on to repeat that several times to make that absolutely clear.
Yeah, I think he says it 3 times.
We spend more on our military than the next 8 nations combined. And of course, Obama says this as if it's something to be proud of. But really, it just shows that I really need to break myself from this habit. It just goes to show that the United States government is really a group of warmongering, fascist, evil people.
Just barbarians. I mean,
and what's particularly hilarious about it is that Obama had listed 4 questions.
Right.
That were the themes of his speech. And number 3 was, how do we keep America safe and lead the world without becoming its policeman? He just goes to show that he doesn't really not want to be the world's policeman. He wants it.
Yeah.
He wants the power. He wants to hold the button in his hand that destroys the world with the click of it.
Right. The pride in American military might in this whole speech is just gushing, and it's really repulsive. I mean, it goes back to this nationalistic pride thing we were talking about earlier. To me, to go on and on about your weapons and your military might and how strong you are is, to me, a sign of a very weak, decaying, sad morality. I mean, these are soulless people who really have no genuine real understanding of their meaning in the world. These are people who want to steal other people's shit and throw their weight around in order to dictate to others how they ought to be. And they call it things like
democracy. Well, the people that are in the government are the people that couldn't find something to do outside of it. Right.
And then, of course, you get your exceptions to the rule every now and then, these people who really want to do good, and they just... well, they're ignorant. They just don't have a full conception of the nature of the economy and how to bring about positive changes in the world.
Well, and that whole notion of doing good, it's something Hayek speaks to in The Road to Serfdom, is that you can go in with good intentions, but it's not going to end well because the system is not meant for that. Right. Obama has a line in there that we have to make the government be the best of us. And it can't. Government will always be the worst of whoever is participating in it. Why? Because they're the ones that have the legal monopoly on guns.
And that's what it really comes down to. And they can get away with it. That's what it really comes down to. So, by the way, folks, every time we discuss government or the state, we're referring to a territorial monopoly on the use of aggressive force. So what's that mean? That means that one institution, namely the state, in a given area, so some land space circumscribed by some boundaries, claims for itself the only legitimate use of aggressive violence, that is, coercive force. So when an example of coercive force is when one individual violates the physical integrity of another person's personal property. So that's why stealing someone's car is wrong. It's why robbing a bank's wrong. It's why shooting someone is wrong. It's
why invading other countries is wrong.
Exactly. That's why taxation is wrong. All of the acts of government involve the utilization of what they claim to be their legitimate right to aggressive force.
And really what you should be doing whenever the government promises something, add to the end of that statement, at the threat of a gun.
Right. And you notice throughout this speech, in fact, we're about midway through, this is a good point to point this out. You notice throughout this speech that there is no reference to things like consent or the voluntary nature of exchange. It's always, we together did this or that. We reinvented our energy structure.
We cured Ebola.
Right. We increased the number of high school graduates. Instead of we subsidized certain energy companies at the harm, or to the dismay of others. We, the government, subsidized certain insurance companies instead of others as far as healthcare is concerned. There's always a loser in state action. There's always somebody who's the victim.
Well, that's because government doesn't have anything of its own. It can only take and redistribute.
Right. So back to the text here. We'll continue on. There's a bit more...
Right, and back still on that police action subject, Obama, again, going back to the whole notion of his not becoming the world's policeman, says, America will always act, alone if necessary, to protect our people and our allies. I think that describes exactly what a police officer is supposed to do, right? Mm-hmm. It's just absurd the number of contradictions that are throughout this speech.
Right. Yeah, we're going to not be the world's policeman, but if we need to be.
if you ask us enough times, we'll go in and bomb you away, I promise.
Right. And then this one's really juicy. I just sort of watched in horror at this line. He says, with nearly 10,000 airstrikes, we, the United States Armed Forces, are taking out their, or ISIS's, leadership, their oil, their training camps, and their weapons. We are training, arming, and supporting forces who are steadily reclaiming territory in Iraq and Syria. I mean, 10,000 airstrikes. Can you imagine living...
And yet he decries those who call for carpet bombing. I think that's exactly what he's doing there.
Yes, he's describing carpet bombing, and we'll just shortly later will denounce
he's carpet
it.
bombing for humanitarian purposes.
Which makes it okay, although contradictory. But really, 10,000... Can you imagine if you were going to walk out of your front door tomorrow, and you could die by... something you don't understand because you live in a technologically unadvanced, undeveloped area. This hurling ball of fire could end your life and your family's. What effect does that have on you psychologically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually? And these people can't understand the phenomenon of blowback? I mean, you're not going to be upset that you and your family could burn alive?
If you weren't upset, I would be worried.
Yeah, that was hard to watch for me. And then, of course, he wants to sort of buttress that by encouraging Congress to give him permission. He ushers them to take a vote. Everybody applauded at that. We know the likelihood of a declaration of war ever passing Obama's fingertips.
Well, wouldn't it be great if Congress actually voted it down? And
that would be fun. That would be interesting.
Not going to happen with the current Congress, but
no.
It's a nice thought.
Shortly after pleading for a vote that he doesn't care about anyway, Obama says, but the American people should know that with or without congressional action, ISIL, his word for ISIS, will learn the same lessons as terrorists before them. So here we have some more bravado threatening, and a total dismissal of any sort of legal or constitutional procedure that one might need in order to launch a war.
Well, again, he just wants to be the policeman.
Right.
And he wants to lead the, 200 or so countries?
200, yeah. That was his word, 200 nations who agreed. This was on climate change, but yeah.
Right, because the president is the king of the world.
Yes. Welcome to American politics. The president is the king. That is all.
Which goes back to when Obama started quoting the Constitution.
Oh, yes.
So he makes the statement, "We the people." Now, of course, those are probably the only 3 words that he has read of the Constitution.
That he knows, yeah.
Especially if he was truly a constitutional law professor, that really cements in my mind the fact that he has not read the Constitution, because my constitutional law class, we certainly didn't.
Yeah.
And it's this whole idea that the government is a we. I didn't sign any agreement.
Yes.
Did you?
No, I meant no. No, of course not no.
Lysander Spooner, in his great pamphlet, No Treason, has this great argument laid out that the Constitution only limits the government, which I think even the Founding Fathers would have agreed with when you look at the terms of the Constitution. It places no mandate on the people. It instead says, Congress shall make no law. Congress shall not do this. Congress shall not do that.
Yeah. Hey, Congress, sit down. And then, of course...
If only.
Yeah.
Can we serve a cease and desist order to Congress?
And then we have Rothbard on the social contract. He says that the state has never been created, the state has never been created by a social contract. It has always been born in conquest and exploitation. The classic paradigm was a conquering tribe pausing in its time-honored method of looting and murdering a conquered tribe to realize that the time span of plunder would be longer and more secure, and the situation more pleasant if the conquered tribe were allowed to live and produce, with the conquerors settling among them as rulers, extracting a steady annual tribute.
Sounds a lot like the mafia.
Yeah, sounds a lot like American politics. All right. Back to
same thing.
Yeah. Forgive my redundancy. Continuing on, the foreign policy approach, before we get to that, I do want to point out that there's a bit of a message in here to other nations around the world. Obama says our, as an American, foreign policy must be focused on the threat from ISIL and Al-Qaeda, but it can't stop there. Instability will continue for decades in many parts of the world. Now, to me, that sounds like a, hey, folks, we're not going anywhere. And, oh, by the way, if we think that there is some quote-unquote terrorist presence in your country, you can expect the U.S. not to come knocking. We don't knock anymore. We'll just go right in.
Because you know that whole notion of habeas corpus and rule of law. Not that there ever was a rule of law, and we know that the Constitution was in fact an illegal coup against the Articles of Confederation before it, and there was a lot of force involved just to pass the Constitution, kind of like a mafia. That there is no government system that will create the best.
Yeah.
And there's no way to, quote, fix our politics. Politics itself is what the problem is.
Yeah, and shortly before finishing up his foreign aspect here, he refers to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which you may or may not have heard of. This has been, according to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a secretive multinational trade agreement that threatens to extend restrictive intellectual property laws across the globe and rewrite international rules on its enforcement. But here's Obama begging and pleading that Congress accept it. He says that it opens markets and protects workers and the environment in order to advance American leadership in Asia. Boy, it sounds like a good deal, huh?
Well, I hate to break it to him, but free trade doesn't require an agreement. Free trade is just exchange between freely acting persons.
If he's all for free trade, drop all the agreements. Let people do as they wish. But the Electronic Frontier Foundation does have a little more on this. The big part of it is the intellectual property aspect. The Electronic Frontier Foundation says the IP chapter would have extensive negative ramifications for users' freedom of expression, right to privacy, and due process, as well as hindering people's ability to innovate. Other chapters of the agreement encourage your personal data to be sent with limited protection to your privacy that would allow foreign corporations to sue countries for laws or regulations that promote the alleged public interest. So really just a whole new vehicle for various bureaucracies to diminish one's ability to trade.
TPP is all about. Yeah. It's about control. He doesn't want free trade. He wants controlled trade.
Right. Managed trade. Exactly.
It's mercantilism, which has been refuted since 1776.
Over and over again. Let's see. Moving forward, he still wants to shut down Guantanamo. He's had 7 years to do it, but still...
if he didn't do it within the first month, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and it's interesting he put it in there.
I think he wanted to go back to the roots of his original campaign, where he said that was a promise you could take to the bank.
Right.
And the fact that he did win the Nobel Peace Prize for that campaign. And
this is our 10,000 drone bomb president.
Right. Clearly, that prize doesn't mean anything. Not that it ever did. Teddy Roosevelt won it too. Oh.
I did enjoy this part. He says, His Holiness Pope Francis told this body, from the very spot I stand on tonight, to imitate the hatred and violence of tyrants and murderers is the best way to take their place. Well, I'm not sure what Obama's definition of murder is, but
I think he qualifies.
I think carrying out the death of innocent women and children on the suspicion that some alleged terrorist is nearby might qualify as murder.
He's not a stranger to threatening people with drones either.
Didn't he take to the correspondence dinner, and he threatened, was it the Jonas Brothers or something, with a drone bombing. You don't know whether to tell whether he's serious or not. I mean, what?
Well, even if he wasn't, the fact that that's just a really sick joke to make.
It is. I'm going to drone bomb you for talking to my daughters. I mean,
But man, we've been talking for over an hour with this. We've dived more deeply into this speech than Obama did himself.
Yeah, clearly. And the rest is not much to wave a stick at. We have about 2 pages left, and it does get pretty petty at the end. There's a lot of, I see the worker working hard on the assembly line. I see the dreamer staying up late. This is fluff.
And in response to that, so I was watching the State of the Union with my mother, and in response to I see it in the dreamer who stays up late to finish her science project, and the teacher who comes in early because he knows she might someday cure a disease. Her exact response to that was, Tabor, the NSA has been in your bedroom for 20 years.
Anyway, folks, we'll go ahead and cut it off here. This has been Peace and Anarchy Episode 2. You can find us at www.peaceanarchy.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/Peace Anarchy Podcast, on Twitter at Voice of Rothbard. And Tabor, what else do you have?
Well, please do check out our Twitter feed before it gets filled up with other stuff. We did live tweet the State of the Union, so you can see my reactions to the entire thing. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for another episode.